Thank you for joining us today as we discuss a little bit about the idea of grace. Particularly, we want to talk about the grace as taught in the book of Galatians. Grace, of course, is a very important topic of Christianity. It's an important topic all the way through the New Testament. The idea of grace means unmerited or undeserved favor. In other words, God gives us something for which we have no right or no merit or do not deserve it in any way. And it cannot be bought. James wrote us in James 4 verse 6, but he gives more grace. Therefore he says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Only when we are humble and submit ourselves to God can we receive the grace of God. We all need the grace of God. But the grace we're going to be looking at today, we find is quite different than what many of the modern conceptions of the grace of God is. First of all, we notice that in the book of Galatians, God's grace comes only through the gospel. Paul wrote in Galatians 1 verse 6, I marvel that you are turning away so soon from him who called you in or by the grace of Christ to another gospel. Paul said that we are called in or by, some translation says by, the grace of Christ to another gospel. Who had called them? God called them, but he called them through the gospel of Christ. We find this idea again in 2 Thessalonians 2 in verse 14, to which he called you by our gospel. So again, Paul said that we have been called by the gospel of Christ. The Galatians, of course, were guilty of accepting another gospel, at least some of them were. They were turning away from the gospel of Christ and accepting another gospel, which, as Paul said, was really not another gospel. It was not good news. They were turning to a false gospel, therefore losing the benefits that was offered by the grace of God. Many people today do much the same thing. People take pride in their liberty to accept any gospel that they prefer. Much stress today is placed on pleasing men. We often hear people say, attend the church of your choice, as if we can just do whatever we want to, and as long as it's called the church, then God will be pleased with it. We need to be much more concerned about attending the church of God's choice than what my choice might be. We must accept only the gospel of Christ. Then we find that grace to the Galatians meant Christian responsibility. In Galatians chapter 2 in verse 9, for example, there we find that when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that had been given to me, they gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we should go to the Gentiles. Notice Paul said he had received the grace of God. But in that context, the grace that he was talking about was his responsibility to preach to the Gentiles. Paul met a great opposition in preaching that gospel, and yet he says it was a grace that was given him. So in grace implies responsibility. We see this again in 2 Corinthians 8 and verse 7. There Paul was talking to the Corinthians, and he said, but as you abound in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in all diligence, and in all your love for us, see that you abound in this grace also. Now, in that context, the grace he was talking about was giving. He was taking up a collection for the poor saints back in Judea. And he was talking about the people there had given more than they should, even, Paul says. Paul said they abounded in this grace, but the grace was giving. You see, far from grace freeing us from any responsibility or work, we find the very opposite to be true. God's grace called Paul and us to sacrifice for God. The God's grace called Paul to sacrifice everything, to give his life to preaching the gospel. To the Corinthians, Paul mentioned about the grace of Christ calling them to give, even very liberally. So God's grace calls us to do something, calls us to respond to God and His Word. We have a responsibility to do something in response to the grace of God. But then we find that the grace of God can also be nullified or made of no value. In Galatians chapter 2 in verse 21, for example, there Paul says, I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness come through the law, then Christ died in vain. In that context, Paul was talking about some of the Jews turning back to the law. And they were trying to accuse Paul of basically saying the law of Moses, the Old Testament law, was of no value whatsoever. Since he was no longer keeping the law as a system of rules, then that means the law was no value. And therefore he was frustrating the grace of God. And Paul says, not that at all. He did not frustrate or nullify the grace of God. The New American Standard translates that verse to nullify. That means to make it of no value. And Paul said just because he turned away from the law of Moses did not frustrate the law at all, the grace of God at all, because if salvation had been through the law, then there was no reason to have the gospel in the first place. You see, when we turn away from the gospel of Christ, that is, turn away from the grace that's been revealed to us through the gospel, then we nullify or we frustrate or make the grace of God of no value. How can we do that? Well, one, as we've already seen, we can do that by teaching that we're made righteous by the Old Testament law. We're not doing that at all. Law keeping is an attempt to earn salvation by doing works. And so when we have the idea that somehow I deserve my salvation by what I do, well, we're frustrating or nullifying the grace of God. And we hear some people say something like that today. They will say, in regards to maybe some person down the street who they consider to be a very good person, they would say, he is just so good, I cannot believe he's going to be lost. In other words, they're saying that person is going to be saved because of his goodness. He deserves salvation. Paul said, none of us can deserve our salvation. We can also make the grace of God of no value by teaching that law is valid, or somehow we earn salvation, as we said. Now, does that mean works is useless? Well, not at all. As we've already pointed out, a response to God's grace is demanded, and that is obedience to what the gospel of Christ commands us. That response is necessary, but that does not mean that somehow we earn or deserve our salvation. But if we somehow turn away from that grace to anything else, then we're making that grace of God of no value. And then we see one other thing, and that is the grace as taught to the Galatians is grace that we can fall away from. In other words, we can lose our salvation that's freely offered us through the grace of God. Again, in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 4, there Paul said, you have become estranged from Christ. You who attempt to be justified by law, you are fallen from grace. Now, to fall from grace means we cut ourselves off from all advantages that we gain in Christ and His gospel. In this context, to fall from grace means to fall into legalism or work salvation. In other words, somehow thinking that you can earn your salvation by your obedience or by your works. And Paul said, when you think that way, then Christ becomes of no value. Yes, there is a danger of Christians falling away. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 12, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. So if we're thinking that we are so righteous that we do not have to worry about losing our salvation, then Paul said you need to be very careful because that's when you're most vulnerable to falling away. How can we fall away from the gospel of Christ? Well, there's several ways we can do that. We can fall away by continuing to live in sin. In Galatians 5:19-21, Paul talks about the works of the flesh. And he goes on in verse 21 to say that whoever practices such things cannot be saved. Now, Paul is not talking about isolated acts of sin, but he's talking about continuous action or living in sin. He uses present tense, which means a continuous action. So he's talking about people who are continually or habitually living in the practice of sin. Paul said when you do that, you cannot be saved. We can also fall away by accepting false doctrine that we've already pointed out, such as believing we're saved by our works. We can also fall by simply giving up. Hebrews 12 and verse 15. The writer of Hebrews warns his readers, said, looking carefully lest anyone fall short of the grace of God. There in that context, we could fall short of the grace of God by simply giving up our Christianity before our life is over. In the very next verse, he compared that to Esau selling his birthright. So when we simply give up serving God because of persecution or we love the world or various other things, anytime we give up serving God, then we are fallen from the grace of God and we have lost our salvation. You see, we've seen several things regarding the grace of Christ. Many of these things are quite different from what people think about today. The grace of God tells us there's only one system of salvation, and that is faith in Jesus Christ. And by that faith, we have access to the grace of God, which includes salvation from our souls and salvation from our sins. But that grace includes responsibility on our part to respond. We have to respond to that grace in obedience. Again, that's quite different. People today who think they're saved by the faith and they have to do nothing at all. They don't have to do anything, or we should obey, they would say, but we do not have to. Well, the Bible teaches that the grace of God includes or implies a responsibility on our part to respond. If we don't respond, then we will not be saved. We also showed that grace can be frustrated or nullified or made of no value if somehow we act as if we can be saved by our own goodness. I don't care how good you may think you are. None of us is so good that we deserve our salvation, and we can never earn our salvation regardless of what we do. It is only by the grace of God that we have the opportunity to be saved. But of course, we can also fall from that grace and be lost once we become a child of God. You see, salvation is not guaranteed to us unconditionally. Again, many people think once you're saved, you're going to always be saved. There's no way to lose it. Well, the Bible makes it clear we can fall away, fall from the grace of God. And if you give up your Christianity before it's over, then we've lost our salvation. I hope this little short discussion about grace maybe helps us to understand what grace is, and also helps us to understand that some of the ideas of grace in our modern world is not exactly like the Bible might teach. May we stand close to the gospel of Christ, because only by accepting and obeying the gospel of Christ can any of us have the hope of salvation. Thank you.